Hey, it's Eli, back again with another look at anarchist themes in the Bible. Since I haven't done one of these types of videos in a while, I decided to go back to the beginning and do an analysis of the two creation myths presented in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. These texts are often looked down on as useless stories meant to prop up literalist creationist interpretations of the Bible, or to justify regressive patriarchal institutions and attitudes. And in fairness, both of these interpretations are disturbingly common. I've thought that these were interesting texts for a while, though, and when looked at a bit more closely, I think they present a view of the world and its problems that may be surprising to some. I've long said that I think the Bible is and was intended to be a revolutionary text for a revolutionary religion, and I think that this starts right out the gate with Genesis. Before getting into the text, I would like to talk for a moment about the purpose of creation myths in the ancient world. While many of the people telling them may have genuinely believed this is how the world began, explaining the origins of the world wasn't really what they were for. The purpose of creation myths is to provide explanations for why certain aspects of the physical and social world are the way they are. Not back then, but today. It's common to see social hierarchies or patterns of oppression justified in creation myths, as part of the purpose of these myths is to provide reasons for why society is the way it is. This is certainly happening in the Genesis story, especially in chapter 3, and we'll dive deeper into that when we get to that portion of the video. But let me just say that even where these justifications for aggressive attitudes do pop up, I think they're handled in an especially interesting way. Before we start getting into the Garden of Eden story, though, let's take a look at Genesis 1. One major stylistic element of the Genesis 1 story that's seen throughout the Bible is something called parallelism. Parallelism is a poetic convention where important points are repeated, but with embellishments or added meaning being thrown in the second time around. A couple silly examples to illustrate the idea would be something like, "I will take a nap, sleep I shall, but only briefly," or "Today is Friday, the weekend dawns this very day." This convention is common in ancient Israelite poetry, and is used throughout the Bible to emphasize particularly important points. The creation story in Genesis 1 is best understood in this context, not as a literal recounting of events, but as a poem arranged in a parallel structure. One good way to illustrate this is to look at what is created on each of the first 6 days. If we take the first 6 days of Genesis 1 and arrange them into 2 stacks of 3, the parallelism begins to jump out at us. On the first day, God creates light. On the second day, he separates the waters of the heavens from the waters of the earth. Basically, he makes the sea and the sky. On day 3, God does 2 things: brings forth the land, and brings forth every sort of seed-bearing plant and trees that grow seed-bearing fruits. Okay, that's the first set of 3. Light, sea and sky, land and seed-bearing plants. Let's look at the next set. On day 4, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, the physical manifestations of the light he created on the first day. Any Christians out there ever been asked why God created light on day 1 but waited until day 4 to create the sun? That's why. Not because that's the order it happened in, but to satisfy the poetic conventions of the time. This continues on day 5, when the sea and the sky, created on day 2, bring forth fish and birds. On day 6, 2 things happen. First, the land, created on day 3, brings forth animals. Second, mankind is created from the soil itself. At the end of all of this, calling back to the creation of seed and fruit-bearing plants on day 3, humankind is commanded to be fruitful and multiply. See it now? The second 3 days are embellishments on the first 3 days. It's parallelism on a large scale. This parallel structure is then broken by the introduction of a 7th day, the day of rest, which underscores the importance of the creation of that day. Genesis 1 is meant to underscore 3 things. The first is that the world is ordered and categorical. The second is that the Sabbath is of utmost importance. The third takes a little more digging to fully understand, and is encompassed in Genesis 1:27. So God created humankind in his own image. In the image and likeness of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Now, after our discussion of parallelism from earlier, your "this is important" sensors should be going off here. I think this is the most important verse in the entire chapter. I'm going to dive real deep into 2 words in this verse, but before I do that, I want to point out something that pops out just at first glance. This isn't a patriarchal view of God. Both men and women are seen as being equally made in God's image. And in fact, the text would seem to imply that God can't be understood at all as male or female, but that one would only be able to understand God as encompassing both. This seems, at first glance, to stand in stark contrast to the creation story in Genesis 2, but we'll get there. First, I want to look at that second line there. In the image and likeness of God he created them. The Hebrew words being translated here are tselem as image and demuth as likeness. If you're looking at your own Bible for reference, you might notice that likeness has been removed from your translation and it only says in the image of God he created them. This is because these 2 words have long been a source of controversy and confusion, and so have been shaved down to 1 in many translations. To understand why, I'll use an example in English. Suppose I were to say that Barack Obama is both well-known and famous. These 2 words, well-known and famous, mean pretty much the same thing, but they carry subtle differences in connotation. Famous connotes the glitz and glamour of Hollywood fame. You may consider Mitt Romney to be well-known. You'd probably recognize him if you saw him, but you probably don't really think of him as famous. However, if you were talking about Mitt Romney to a friend and they said they didn't know who that was, you might reply with something like, "Really? He's kinda famous." See, these words are near synonyms. They can be used pretty much interchangeably in many contexts, but actually connote slightly different things. And so when they're used together, they illustrate that the person being described is described by the connotative meanings of both words. In this case, that Barack Obama is well known in the way politicians are, but is also famous in the sense that celebrities are. In the same way, you might describe someone as big and fat, or tall and lanky, or small and slight, near synonyms that may be used somewhat interchangeably on their own, but actually have slightly different meanings that jump out at you when they're used together. Demuth and tselem are sort of the same deal. They both mean likeness, and are sometimes used interchangeably, but tend to be used in slightly different contexts. Demuth is the more straightforward of the 2. It means likeness, as in something is somehow functionally similar to another thing. A car is like a truck, a mule is like a donkey, things like that. This seems to say that humans are somehow functionally similar to God. And since the next verse goes on to describe the purpose of humans as being to govern creation, this is perhaps not entirely surprising. Tselem, on the other hand, is a bit more packed with meaning. Tselem, like demuth, means likeness, and may be used the same way in many contexts. It's the word used to describe the likeness children have to their parents, for instance. However, tselem also has another very specific meaning that demuth never stands in for. Tselem is the word used to describe idols made in the likeness of other gods. When the Jews are commanded in the second commandment not to make graven images, they are being told not to make tselem. When Moses destroys the idols of the Canaanites, he's described as destroying tselem. Tselem, while also sometimes used to describe a more mundane likeness, is pretty much always used to describe the idols made in the likeness of gods. When looked at in this context, the command that the Jews not pray or sacrifice to man-made tselem makes sense. If God provided mankind as his tselem, then if you want to ask someone who isn't God for help, you should ask one of them, your fellow humans. If you feel the need to provide an offering to a tselem, then don't lay it at the feet of a statue, feed a human who needs to eat. These tselem God created, humans, are the only images of God worthy of such things. Humans are not just functionally made in the image of God, but are the closest thing he has to representations on earth, made in his image in the same sense that the Israelites' neighbors believed their idols were made in the image of their gods, and worthy of the same sort of respect. This isn't just some particular human or a class of humans either, but all of them. This seems pretty anarchist to me, and stands apart from the poetic structure of the chapter as one of the most important verses, if not the most important verse in the text. While Genesis 1 focuses on big things, the nature of the world, time, and humankind, Genesis 2 and 3 bring things back down to earth, and seek to explain the existence of the oppressive human social structures seen in the world. These chapters often get painted as a justification for patriarchy, framing women as weak and vulnerable to temptation, and so justifying the existence of patriarchy in the ancient world. I'll make the case here that while these chapters do try to grapple with the existence of patriarchy as well as other forms of oppression, they don't justify it, and actively condemn it as an example of human evil in contrast to God's intended plan for humankind. When Eve is created in this story, it isn't concurrently with Adam, but from his rib. I have no special anarchist reading for this bit. It's likely some bit of local folklore, and there are definitely some issues here. But there's something interesting about this creation story that I think makes it a good place to start. One of Adam's first jobs in the garden is to name all the creatures in it. Just prior to the creation of Eve, God brings forth every creature to Adam, and Adam gives them their name. This, when you hear it first, sounds kind of silly. One may imagine a guy sitting on a rock saying, "Oh, I'm feeling squirrel for this one." But that's not really what the text would have been describing to the ancient Israelites reading it. Common throughout the ancient world was an idea known as nominalism. The idea that the true name of a person, place, thing, or deity gave some insight into its true nature, and even the ability to potentially control it. To the ancient Israelites, these true names were a very real part of the structure of the world, one that determined the nature and destiny of created things. And these are the names that Adam is dispensing here. This is a job normally assigned to a deity, but it's here given to a human being. So, after naming all the animals, it's determined that none of them will do as a companion for Adam. So God places Adam into a deep sleep, and Eve is there when he wakes up. She isn't called Eve yet, and won't be until after the fall. When Adam wakes up, he calls her woman, for she was taken out of a man. This pun actually works in English because Hebrew has a very similar thing going on with the words for man and woman, where the word for woman is the same as the word for man with an extra syllable tacked on at the end. But he doesn't name her here, not in the way he does the other animals. He didn't have dominion over her like he did them. He merely stated what he was going to call her. This equal status is also seen in the temptation narrative. Eve is the one shown talking to the snake, but when they eat the fruit, Eve gives the fruit to Adam, who was with her, to eat. She didn't have to go find him. He was right there the whole time. He witnessed the whole exchange, nodding along dumbly and not saying anything. There was no trickery or deception here. It's not like she was tempted and then went and tempted Adam. She was the one talking, but they were both there for the whole conversation. When it comes time to come clean, though, well, then Adam does what people have been doing to Eve ever since. Points the finger and declares that it was the woman you gave me who gave me the fruit, blaming both God and Eve for something he did all on his own with all the context and information she had. Instead of owning his mistakes, he threw Eve under the bus. In this moment, everything was thrown into flux. Humans were not meant to take instruction from animals, but they did, and so their dominion over them was shattered. And so the beasts would now fight them for resources and kill and eat the dust that was their flesh. Men were not meant to dominate, betray, and scapegoat women, But that became their way when Adam broke the trust between himself and Eve in a sad ploy to save his own skin. Capping this all off in what is literally the very first verse to follow humankind's expulsion from the garden, Adam finally names Eve. This paints a picture that I think is quite different from the simple justification of social system often seen in creation myths. While the Bible authors did seek to explain why the patriarchal system in place throughout the ancient Near East was there, they didn't seek to justify it or enshrine it as part of God's plan. It was very much not part of God's plan, a sickening inequity that came into being with the fall. Things are the way they are, not because that's the way they're supposed to be, but because we are, and always have been, doing it wrong. This isn't just limited to patriarchy either. Adam doesn't just laze about in the garden, he works. He was created to tend that garden, after all. But after the fall, he doesn't just work, he toils. Struggle, scarcity, and alienation from the products of our labor is, like patriarchy, an evil blot on creation brought forth by humankind. Now, the Bible just kind of leaves it here. The idea of ending these blights on humankind, to them, seemed like an impossible fantasy. But we aren't them. If we realize that patriarchy, capitalism, racism, bigotry, and all these other systems of oppression that we find ourselves crushed under today aren't the way things are supposed to be, we're in a place where we can finally start to ask the question, what do we do about it? Eden isn't really a place. Try and find it based on the instructions given in Genesis, and you'll quickly be scratching your head. Instead, it's a vision of how human beings could live, reconstructed through the lens of these people at this time. It's a place where we all stand equal and are connected to one another and to the fruits of our labor. That's something we could create here. I'm going to ignore the final verse in this story, or at least leave it for a future video. Because while it implies that we're being kept out of this place by hostile outside forces, and that there's nothing that can be done to save us from our current condition, I think we should all be striving to get back to Eden.